Hello and welcome to The Toughest Choice. I'm Stephanie Reynolds. I am thrilled to have a fascinating guest with me today, Effenus Henderson. And Effenus is the president and CEO of HenderWorks and the co-founder of the Institute for Sustainable Diversity and Inclusion. And he had just over 40 years of experience at Weyerhaeuser in many human resource roles, including recruiting and staffing, HR strategic business partner to many areas, and for many years as their chief diversity officer up until 2013. And he also is an internationally recognized diversity thought leader. He's been invited to numerous companies and organizations to share his expertise. I'm going to add one little example of that just because your bio is really something, Effenus. He's addressed members of the General Assembly of the United Nations on intercultural and interreligious diversity and addressed a high-level panel of the Alliance of Civilizations in Madrid, Turkey, Rio de Janeiro, and Qatar, all the way from 2008 through 2011. So thank you for being with us today and welcome. Welcome, Effenus.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Terrific. So can you give us a little bit of background on your current roles in HenderWorks and if you are still engaging in the Institute for Sustainable Diversity and Inclusion?
Sure. Well, first of all, HenderWorks, we celebrate 25 years of existence this year. And I started prior to my leaving Weyerhaeuser, and it was sort of held in abeyance until my retirement. Initially, it was founded to capture human resource information electronically as the boom for technology and social media began to shape how people got information. And so it was that initial beginning. I also, during that time, used HenderWorks as a publishing arm of my son's recording work. He's a Grammy Award-winning producer and has done a lot of work in the music industry, and in fact, currently sits on the Recording Academy's board of directors. So that was the first part of the work. So I didn't really gear up HenderWorks until I retired, and my essential mission for HenderWorks, and my theme is the power of one, minds of many, was to use it as a way to consult with organizations who were interested in strategic planning, human resource management, in particular diversity, equity, and inclusion, because of the work that I did previously with the Weyerhaeuser Corporation as Chief Diversity Officer and setting strategic frameworks for this type of work. At the same time, a good friend of mine, Barbara Dean, who had been the founder and owner of what's called the Northwest Diversity Learning Series, which was a collaborative effort with major corporations here in the Pacific Northwest, would bring together through workshops, online workshops, and in-person workshops at the Nordstrom Corporation to really continue the discussion and education around best practices in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And at the time, Barbara and I decided to found ISD, we call it ISD, the Institute for Sustainable Diversity and Inclusion, a nonprofit organization founded in the state of Washington. We wanted to continue the effort of helping to provide education for employees and people in the Pacific Northwest in particular around emerging diversity, equity, and inclusion topics. And so I kind of do two things. I have sort of the HenderWorks hat, which is my personal business, and ISD, which is a nonprofit that also really focuses on education and consulting and so forth as well.
I love that. And the learning series, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned it was hosted, I think, at Nordstrom, but there were some big organizations involved in that series as well.
That's absolutely correct. Over the years, we had a number of very fine sponsors and supporters, including obviously Nordstrom, Amazon, Alaska Airlines, the Weyerhaeuser Corporation, the Boeing Corporation, Starbucks, SAP Concur, Port Blakely, the Port of Seattle. And I know I could go on and on and on, but over the years, we did have a very good set of sponsors and subscribers and so forth. And that was very helpful because what it allowed us to do was to create a networking forum for organizations and their employees to share best practices, to talk about issues that were emerging around DEI, and to come up with some ideas around how to improve and align diversity, equity, and inclusion work with the core mission and values of the organizations that they were part of. And so this became a good place for people to do this. And it included bringing in, nationally known speakers on specific topics in the area of DEI. It wasn't DEI specifically all the time. It ranged from talent management, for example, to cultural issues within the workplace, to very targeted issues around the LGBTQIA community and with women and so forth. So we tried to let the series evolve as the context for these issues sort of evolved in civil society in America and around the world.
Wow, powerful. Well, I want to come back to ask you about the current state after we get a little bit more into you and your leadership experiences, because I can't just leave that. We got to talk about today. So just about you and your leadership, you've been exposed to so much in terms of leaders, yourself being a leader, all these organizations. So you have I'm sure, a plethora of experience and understanding about that space. And so I just am curious, what initially brought you to leadership roles?
It was an evolutionary process. And Weyerhaeuser, as a company that I worked for obviously 40 years, had a very strong promote from within and development program. Through my career, I was allowed to be exposed to a number of different educational workshops and seminars. In fact, I was honored to be allowed to go to Stanford's executive program for a summer. And that really sharpened, that was in 1995, and that really sharpened my idea around human resources work as a strategic partner within organizations. And that when you talk about creating optimum outputs for the organization, a lot of the work during that era was around high performance work systems and total quality and so forth. A lot of it focused on sort of the technical side, but not the social side. And so as we started to evolve at Weyerhaeuser, we said there is a human component, there is a people component that's equally as important, because if you don't have the perspectives, the ideas, the opinions, the types of people who can inform the organization about its processes, policies, or even its products, you may in fact suboptimize your output and impact your sustainability as an organization. So as I evolved in terms of my leadership work in HR and talent management, I realized that a lot of this work is essentially a lens through which you look at the total system of your processes and practices within the organization. And the folks who really drive that on a sustainable, ongoing basis are leaders, even with the work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. When I first moved into the role, I was called the Director of Recruiting, Staffing, and Diversity. And as we got into it, we found that diversity really was something that should be integrated into everything. And that when I had discussions with leaders, they said, well, the things you're talking about are effective leadership characteristics and traits, aren't they? In terms of fairness, honesty, integrity, getting the optimum out of people. We said that is in fact correct. And that if you're talking about building a system that's sustainable, doesn't it follow that you have to really make sure that the customers, the stakeholders, the communities in which you operate are pleased at how you do your business, how you work, how you operate, and how you treat not only your employees, but how you treat us as customers, and do you value our opinions and thoughts and ideas. And so we began to share the role that if you're really looking at sustainability, you're really going to have to look at the people side of it, not just the employee, but again, the customer, the the researchers, the engineers, all of that play a role. And the organization, as we've seen from studies by McKinsey and others, that get that right, generally outperform those that don't.
Yes, I love the connection between not just the customer and good leadership. Like the definition of great leadership includes is synonymous to a great extent with what full inclusion and diversity really ultimately means, if I'm paraphrasing accurately. But then also to the concept of sustainability broadens as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it broadens as well, because it isn't just about making sure we're green in the way we manufacture. It's so far beyond that, where that's also integrated into the whole system of how we treat each other, how we treat our customers, how we treat resources, and so on. Is that fair?
That is absolutely correct. In fact, for 3 years, I served on the EPA's Environmental Justice Advisory Council, where they wanted to understand how to think of the EPA sustainability objectives and so forth using a DEI lens, particularly with underserved communities and particularly with patterns of environmental degradation impacting certain communities more significantly than others. And the question is, how do you invite and involve those communities in decisions that affect their communities and so forth? And how do you listen? And how do you act based on that information you gather? That's all part of creating an environmentally responsible government agency around environmental degradation and so forth, and its impact on various communities.
Powerful. So Weyerhaeuser afforded you this growth opportunity, and it opened up so many avenues for you. How would you characterize, or how would you have characterized your leadership philosophy?
My tagline for my business, HenderWorks, is called the Power of One, Minds of Many. That in order to optimize output and responses, you can't take it on, you can't own it. It's more about sharing and listening to others to help inform the work you do and to give back in terms of helping them be better at what they do. And so for me to really create a more inclusive leadership style is to suggest that really helps the organization and the team that you're working with do their best, and they feel like they're connected, they feel they're part of the organization, and they're being seen, they're being heard, and they're being respected. And so the real challenge is not going in as the authority or the expert, or there's only one way to solve this and I got the answer. That's not it. That may have been the way 50 years ago, but in this new age, it's really about connections. It's really about listening, and it's really about understanding the needs of the customers, whether the customer is the people within the organization you serve in a support role or externally as customers or clients and so forth. So for me, the leadership philosophy that I have is one, to be honest, to be truthful, to really not try to convince or persuade or even diminish the right of that person I'm working with to speak and to talk and to share their own perspectives, and to not think that I've got the only solution to the problem. That the best solutions are shared solutions that really take the best of what everyone says, and you come back with a solution that makes the most sense for the organization at that time. That's the other part of it that I learned at Weyerhaeuser, being a cyclical industry, that there are times when things are just going very well, and there are times when the market goes south and people aren't buying houses. And so during those times, what I learned is that you have to make adjustments, right, in terms of staffing, in terms of resource allocation. And so as a leader, you can't be wedded to one approach, one way of managing your operation. You have to stay kind of agile, I'll call it agile, and adapt to changing conditions, whether that's the market, sometimes it's the leadership. You may have a new CEO who has a new and different approach to how things should be done. So all of that, in my mind, is what I've learned to do, is to be adaptive, but to stay true to both the organization's core values, right, in terms of safety, honesty, respect, and so forth. I served on the company's business conduct committee for a number of years where we addressed issues of ethics and ethics violations and inappropriate business conduct. So I learned how if you're really going to be respected and seen as a valued partner with customers and clients and communities, you really have to be honest, ethical, and above board in the way you work.
Well, there's a huge 3-day class right there in that answer. I'm not That's a lot. And it's great because the consistent thread around the leaders that are making tough choices in favor of the business and the people are these characteristics you've enumerated so eloquently. And that has to do with commitment to getting to the right answer through the most number of people from an engagement standpoint that is timely.
One of the things I also want to say, particularly in the work in terms of establishing frameworks for change, is that you can't go in preaching. You've got to understand and listen to where people are, and not to be in an evaluative sense, but to be in an appreciative sense, to say, well, I recognize that, for example, in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, most business leaders have not spent a lot of time thinking about or even managing or providing guidance to these kinds of efforts. So that if you're going to go in and try to create a strategy you think might work for them, you just can't go in and impose it. You've got to create an environment where they are learning about it. I say go slow to go fast. Time to understand, to reflect, to think about it, and to actually practice. I call it, and that's part of my spine book that I've written. It's called Strategy, Practice, Ideation, Need, and Execution. Strategy is kind of, how does this impact who we are as a business in terms of our strategic direction? The P is practice. If we're not good at, how do we create the kinds of mechanisms and behaviors to help to reinforce and create a consistent application of that strategic approach in terms of how we're going about it? The I is around ideation, that you can't keep doing the same thing all the time. You got to be creative and innovative and allow for new perspectives to help shape how you're going about your business. The N is around need, and you can't do everything. So let's face, most organizations work on fairly tight budgets in all areas. And so what you want to do is to really have a laser focused on, if I'm being asked to help create a framework that incorporates diversity into what you do, the question becomes, what's the problem you're trying to solve? What's the processes you're trying to develop and incorporate? And what's the outcome you're trying to achieve as a result of that? So having sort of a planning PDCA model in terms of the process, and then focus on the vital few. Don't try to cover the waterfront. And then the execution, because it's one thing to design and come up with the creative approach. It's the other thing to execute. And what I see oftentimes, people sort of stall out right at the end of the design phase because it's heavy work. But they then have to transition into kind of, okay, who's accountable for this? How are we going to measure how well we're moving along in this way? And how do we hold people accountable? And how do we communicate and talk about it in a way that reinforces kind of what we're trying to do over time? Because I believe in practice and repetition as a way of grounding and deepening commitment and understanding of what you're trying to do.
Well, we're going to make sure and put that link to your book in the chat. I'm going to kind of go a little deeper with you personally now.
Sure. Okay.
Just so that, in terms of understanding, I always am interested in what you would consider a success, what the leaders I speak to would consider a great success in their histories.
A couple of things. I would say, first and foremost, I served as the convener for a working group under the auspices of the International Organization for Standardization, which is the oldest, largest standard setting organization in the world. And several of us petitioned ISO to allow a working group to develop the first guidance standard for diversity and inclusion. If you are not familiar with ISO processes, they're very meticulous,
Mm-hmm.
peer-reviewed, and incremental. You have to go through process 1, step 2, step 3, and there are reviews and so forth. And you also have to respond to commentary. Every comment that's made about the proposed standard has to be addressed. And in this particular case, it involved not just people from the US, but people from a number of different countries around the world, from the UK to Finland to Germany to France to Pakistan to Asia. And their opinions matter just as much as anyone else's. And so for me, getting a standard written and taken through the ISO process, in my mind, was one of the most significant and important accomplishments that I made outside of my Weyerhaeuser experience and so forth. The other one I would say is my role with the National Urban League. I was on the local board of an affiliate for the National Urban League for a lot of years. In fact, I broke the rules in terms of tenure. I should have been off long before I did, but I was the president of the local board. I was then elevated to a regional trustee, which covered all of the affiliates in the Western U.S. And I was the president of the Council of Affiliate Boards for the national organization for 3 years. And so that taught me a lot about the issues that everyday people are facing, the lived experiences, the things that people often ignore and don't appreciate to the level that they should in terms of public policy and in terms of economic inequality and all the things that we hear about. And so for me, that was another gratifying experience to be able to navigate, a world where average day-to-day people were just trying to get by. On the other hand, in a corporate environment where everyday people were trying to ensure the company's sustainability and so forth over time. So, and in what I recognized in both is that the one certainty you have is that there will be change. And the question is, how do you step up to it, or how do you bury your head in the sand? And I'd say bury your head in the sand is not an option. You've got to figure out, how do I navigate through this good period, this bad period, because it is an ongoing process of what I call quality improvement to meet the context. That's the other thing, the context
Yes.
of the time.
It's a theme that you keep coming back to, this resilient adaptability, being contextually relevant, being timely, as well as being realistic is what I'm hearing as well. And not we may want things to be different. We may wish things would go in a certain direction right away. But I'm hearing, if this feels right to you, that this persevering kind of understanding that pulls on lots of different aspects of who you're dealing with, what the context is, what the content is about, what the process is this willingness to keep engaging, continuing on, and not holding an attachment necessarily. That's my word for an outcome in the immediate way that you want it. And that's resilient. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that part of that is being a lifelong learner, that you're never really arriving in, you're never really there. And to appreciate others and be curious and not think your way is the only way. I grew up on a farm in North Carolina, eastern North Carolina, among siblings. I have 11 siblings, and my mom died when I was 13, and the youngest was like 1 year old. And one of the commitments that my father made was he would not separate us. So we had to figure out a way to grow up together. So what that taught me was that the end game is growing up. And the end game is figuring out a way to help each other with this entity, the family, such that everyone can grow up and be successful. And so it really taught me a lot about community, about sharing, and about appreciating neighbors and friends and family, reaching out and the families reaching in to say, what do you need? How can we help? And so forth. And so that's been part of my philosophy of giving back. And in fact, people say, well, why are you still doing all this? Why don't you on the golf course and or doing something? And what I tell folks is that when I look back and see my father and so forth and what he had to do, it was an appreciation that this is not for me because I'm okay. I'll be okay. And my wife and I will be okay, but it's for my children, grandchildren, and those that will come after me. So I have a belief that and a philosophy that that's what I have to do. I have to pass it forward.
Powerful. Thank you for sharing that. That informs so much of how we respond to the world. And I really appreciate you sharing that. I'm curious about how you might frame an unsuccessful leadership moment, given all these circumstances you've been sharing. How might you think about that?
Well, I'll tell a personal story about my journey at Weyerhaeuser because it wasn't all, as one of my colleagues at Weyerhaeuser would say, it was not always honky dory, right?
Yes, yes.
It was, there were times when things were good. There were leaders who were better than others, some not so good. But I recall one time when we had gone back to North Carolina because my wife and I and our three kids would try to find time so we'd go back and visit my father and her family. And this one year was 1983, Christmas. We went back and spent time with her family and my family. And we got back, and it was a lot to just afford to go back there. And so we didn't have any money to do much more than that. We come back and live, right? 2 weeks after I got back, my father passed away unexpectedly from an aneurysm. And so we talked about that. And I went back. My wife and kids stayed here because we couldn't afford to do the same thing again. It was just too expensive. So she said, that's one thing we were to do it all over again, we'd probably go back again. But after that, about 2 weeks after that, the HR organization at Weyerhaeuser started a reorganization of the HR function. They brought in a business leader with no background and grounding in HR work, but he had an idea about how he wanted to structure the organization at the director level. And by that time, I had done a number of different assignments in HR, from being an HR generalist to an HR specialist. And so he called me one day and said, here's kind of my plan. I'm reorganizing the organization. I'm going to create 4 new jobs. And don't worry, you'll have a job somewhere, but you're not going to be a candidate for one of the 4 jobs. And number one, I was a little bit offended that I'd get that kind of message a week or so after I get back from my father's funeral. I was already kind of still distraught about that, but I said, "Oh, what would my dad do?"
Yeah.
And so he said, "Well, you don't just throw in the towel. You, particularly if the person that you're having a conversation with doesn't fully appreciate your background or experience or knowledge." So I said,
and how could he? How could he if he had no background in HR? Yeah.
So I said, so my purpose is to inform him of my background, my education, my experience, and so forth, so that if he does make a decision, he can't say that I didn't really know you had that level of background knowledge and experience. So that was before a lot of the technical stuff we have today was available. You didn't have PowerPoint, right? You didn't have a lot of things. And so I said, okay. So I had first updated my resume and listed a lot of the things that I had done with the company and my education and all of that. I talked about some of the things that I felt pretty good about having achieved in those roles. I said, but that's not enough. I've got to kind of give him a view or perspective of what it might be like for me to lead one of those jobs, what my vision would be, how I might carry it out, and so forth. So I laid that out. And so I went back and I said, and my family, my wife and I talked about it. I said, well, you got to lose, right? I mean, we're not going to one of those places where that he believes I would be a good fit for at one of our operating facilities. I didn't want to go. It was a very small rural town in Oklahoma. I wasn't having that, was not going there. So I went back in that morning, and I recall him. I think at that time people were still smoking in organization inside buildings in their office. He had a pipe or something. At least I kind of remember that to be the case. And he said, "Okay, so tell me, what do you decide about these options I presented? I said, well, here's the deal. I have not thought a lot about those because before I consider any of those, I want to understand why you think I'm not qualified for one of those positions. Before you answer that question, I want to give you a little bit of information so that you can have an informed view of my background and experiences. So I said, here's my resume. Let me walk you through that. Here's some of the things that I've done. Here's my ratings, performance ratings in terms of my capabilities and assessments over the last few years, which were all fairly positive, right? But I said, that's probably not going to be enough for you. You probably have an idea of what you want to do with the function. So based on how you describe those positions, here's my vision of how I would approach them.
Well, I just want to pause here. That's a risk. You took a big risk. I mean, I guess if you knew I wasn't going to take the other option,
yeah,
you were still, the timing might not have been your timing exactly, but you were ready to put it on the line, but also, if I might say, put yourself in his shoes, even though they were uninformed and rash potentially, and say, what does he need to know? Actually, let me educate him in a backdoor way about how he should be thinking about these roles. Sounds like you reverse engineered the whole thing a little bit.
Kind of, sort of, but I didn't know what I was doing, other than a feeling that I need to allow him the opportunity to have that insight about what and whom I'm working with. So what I did cover that, and then I said, so before you finalize your decision, because I'm not making mine until you tell me why you feel that I'm not qualified. And I said, I'll give you time to think about it because I probably hit you with stuff that you were not expecting. So we came back together a couple of days later, and the bottom line, I got one of those 4 jobs.
You did.
I got it. Yes.
Well, I would not classify that as an unsuccessful leadership moment. That was a breakthrough. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I love it. I mean, was that your toughest choice? I ask this question as well because, there are times when we have to make those tough choices as leaders that we are in a very risky situation.
Yeah.
And we put ourselves, and sometimes they work out and sometimes they don't, but we have to put ourselves and pull away from the expectation, the status quo. Maybe it's security, maybe it's money, maybe it's position, power, and pull away from that. Because, 40 years inside of a corporation, you ate, drank and everything else. You can't not be in that water. So I'm curious, how you might characterize a toughest choice moment for you or situation. That may be another one. Yeah.
Well, I guess this is another one. A few years later, one of the organizations that I was the HR director for within the company was the shipping company, Weyerhaeuser's Westwood Shipping Lines. And it was a small entity, but it was part of some other, batch of businesses that I provided support to. And one of the competitors for Westwood actually sought me out, fairly high-level position in learning and development, training and education. And the issue was that I would have to relocate to Oakland, California. And I got excited about it and actually accepted the position and went down and we looked at housing and everything. We said, oh, gee, it's going to be very expensive here, even with that bump. And my kids were still in school. My oldest son was maybe entering high school. And so it was a tough decision because I'd already submitted my resignation to my boss. And a couple of days later, my wife and I talked about it. We just said, I don't think we can do this. We don't want to disrupt the family and so forth, even though it was a position that would likely, in terms of compensation, would have been almost double my salary. But again, it was a different state. And so whether or not that really was a doubling was another question. But what I went back and did, I told my boss that I've changed my mind. I'm staying. I'm not going. But he could have said, well,
Sorry,
sorry,
that train has left the
that
station.
train has left the station. But he didn't. I returned to my job, and that was another lesson in terms of what was driving me towards that decision. Was it the opportunity, or was I running away from a boss that was more of an autocratic, everything I say goes, and I don't want to listen to you, you just do what I say? I came to terms with thinking that it was probably more about not feeling good about the relationship with that boss, who everyone around me also had a similar perspective about, but he seemed to have some powerful friends in high places, so I had to tread that one carefully. But that was the one that was a bit of a downer for me in terms of just kind of going through that entire process. But I learned from it. Again, I learned that you have a voice, and there are times when you have to use that voice. There are opportunities that come past you that if you don't at least put your voice to advocating for yourself, it might pass you by and you'll wonder, why did I not get that? And so for me, the leadership role is being confident, assertive, particularly if you feel like you're just as capable as the next person that's applying for the job. So that was a learning for me in terms of that. And also that it was also learning around money and rewards and so forth, that oftentimes the tangible rewards of higher pay and so forth don't compensate for the intangible impact that it has on family and relationships and so forth. And so that was one of the most powerful things that I learned.
Those are great examples, both of them. Yeah, I just appreciate the intrinsic rewards that you were just talking about and the risk again that you took and as you perceived it, the difficulty, the downer of having to backtrack and still work for the more difficult boss. That's courageous. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
But what I also learned about the more difficult boss is sometimes that difficulty isn't what it appears to be. It
Oh,
may
yeah.
just
Yeah,
be a
yeah.
very rigorous boss that really has high expectations for what and how you should be performing. So I had to think about that. Is it that, or is it something else? So
I love it. I love that. Well, giving him a fair shake, as well as looking at yourself around your own motivations.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
powerful. And I would call that, we're kind of thinking about a maturity model for what does it really mean to be a holistic, full-on leader these days, executive. And there's so many inputs. The examples you just gave, though, are really tangible and powerful. Thank you for that. And I want to make sure I have enough time to ask you about what you think leaders need today, and then also kind of how that may or may not intersect with the current state of the efforts to move diversity and inclusion forward and what's going on. You can marry them or you can separate them, whichever seems right to you.
Yeah. I've done a lot of research and studying about the current state, and it is sort of running in a different direction than what I was taught and what I learned and how we managed the business at Weyerhaeuser over the years when I was there. We had a fairly significant business conduct. We had a very strong commitment to inclusion and diversity, and we were honest. That was a high expectation. Be honest, be ethical, act with integrity, and don't accept unnecessary gifts that could influence your ability to lead and to govern and so forth. What I see in this environment here is that people have backed away from some of those fundamental leadership characteristics that have supported many and still support many businesses today. But what I see is that people have elevated themselves into key government positions and have lost sight of those. And I think that's a tragedy and a risk for American democracy, because my belief is that diversity, equity, inclusion, this is a theme from some writings I'm doing now, is not the defect. Exclusion is when you exclude perspectives, opinions, people from a system that they should be a part of. You've sub-optimized the outcome and you lead more to more authoritarian, more loyalty to the person than to the institution, whether it's the US, whether it's the company or the community. And that's the sad part of it. And what I see now is that we're losing some of those fundamental values that have always guided America. And I worry about that. And I worry about leaders who are challenged. And I'll have to put myself in their place in terms of if they're a significant federal contractor or a nonprofit with significant grants from the government, how they're having to opt for either foregoing some of those principles or losing business. And that's not a very good place to be in. But I would say in the longer term, it is probably better to back away and say, I don't need that contract. I don't need that grant if it impinges on my ability and my freedoms as an organization, as a company, because fundamentally that erodes, the principles of democracy overall, that I'm willing to suffer that. And I know it's going to be hard to do that, but I must do it. And I must commend the folks over at Costco, because I think they are doing just that. They are defending who they are, how things like inclusion and equity and so forth are fundamental to who they are and how they lead and how they stay resilient and how they push back on these intimidation practices and so forth. And so as a leader in this era, the choices are fairly clear. Are you going to bury your hand and focus on loyalty to a person? Or are you going to be much more assertive in saying that I'm more for the people, for the country, for the Constitution, and so forth? So for me, I think those are fundamental pivots that you make. And I think in the short term, you may wind up looking good by some. But in the long run, I think it really eats at the character of you and your organization. And in the end, it could impact your own sustainability because shareholders, stakeholders are not, the most part, are not buying it. When you look at some of these decisions by companies, boards of directors in terms of shareholder resolutions and so forth, are running 99-1 in favor of continuing the practices that they have.
Fascinating, that what you just quoted. And I think important. And so if I can add on to what you're saying, my impression from talking to many in kind of how does that kind of trickle down into the day-to-day, people are so hungry for getting back to those values you were elucidating and are so hungry for authenticity, honesty, and trustworthiness. And so the optimist in me says this is a period of reckoning. And I wonder if you hold the same point of view, given what you just said about shareholder voting and intention being so overwhelmingly pro, 99%, you said, in favor of continuing these inclusive activities and policies, that they're hand in hand with trustworthiness and integrity and so on, and authenticity. I'm hearing it everywhere in terms of all the connections, conversations, that people are so hungry for it that I do think in the hopefully not too longer run, they will prevail. They will resurrect.
I think you're absolutely correct. I think that they will prevail. And I think most people are honest, hardworking people, and they want everyone to be treated with fairness and dignity. And they're not ones to turn a blind eye to injustice or poverty or any of those things that most people say, we're big enough, we could do both. And we need to think about that in a positive sense. Unfortunately, I don't think our leaders today are thinking that deeply about these issues. And I think for the most part, and I've learned a lot about this current value population as being very, very short-term oriented. and it's about me and what I can get out of it, as opposed to it's about my family, it's about my country, and what's in the best interest of the country. I don't see that in the way that we saw it years ago, when there was a balance, in terms of this continuum that we've got to learn how to do both, because that's essentially who we are.
Yes, we need to learn how to do both. Again, it's there. It's still there. It hasn't evaporated. It's just gotten compartmentalized, pushed aside, I think, by many. And I think that it's available. People are already so hungry for it. I think people need a confirmation like you shared so much about how everything fits together, the integration of how we treat each other, how we treat our customers, how we go to market, how we create policy, what values we govern by, and the environment, and being inclusive of all communities, how that really creates sustainable planet, sustainable business,
Exactly.
sustainable customer base. And I think that that's a connection that a lot of people don't make. So that insight, I think, is really, really powerful. So much you've shared today. I think there's just so much to learn from you, Effenus. I so appreciate your time. And I thank you so much for being willing to share your experience and your heart with us.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening. To hear more conversations with leaders, please subscribe to The Toughest Choice wherever you listen to podcasts. For updates, please connect with me on LinkedIn. This is Stephanie Reynolds. Thanks for listening.